Guys, my brain is going to work. This climate is so hot. Yeah, how I can actually feel difficult when you're always how can you say that? Hey, what are you fighting for? Not our work anyway. You don't know anything about the subject. Haha, but you didn't ask me. You know what? When I was studying in secondary, I am one of the best students. Come here, my grandchild. Your Lola will tell you everything about 21st century.
Literature is from the Latin word litera, which means a letter of the alphabet. Britannica also defines literature as a body of writing belonging to a given language or people. Also, the 11th edition of Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary defines literature as writings having excellence of form or expression and expressing ideas of permanent or universal interest. Why we need to read literature? Of what value is a literature? There are different importance of literature. Number one, reading great literature exercises the imagination, which means we meet characters and immerse ourselves in their worlds, experiencing their sorrows and joys. In a way, an active imagination helps us perceive truth, make sound judgments, and deal with our concerns in life in more creative ways. Number two, reading literature transports us out of our current situation into other periods and places. This means interacting with characters across space and time gives us knowledge about a specific period and culture. Now let's proceed to the third importance of literature. Reading literature enables us to see the world through the eyes of others. Meaning, literature trains the mind to be more accepting and understanding of other points of view. It sets aside personal prejudices to see life through the eyes of someone from another age or race. Number four, great works of literature have played a fundamental role in shaping society. Like, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh became a popular and influential blueprint for literature around the world. Other landmarks include Homer's Odyssey, Dante's Divine Comedy, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and Cervantes' Don Quixote. Like in the Philippines, Jose Rizal's novels No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo and poems were the conclusion of the propaganda movement. His two novels portrayed corruption and oppression by the Spanish government. Andres Bonifacio, who headed the Philippine Revolution, wrote Ang Pag-ibig sa Tinubuang Lupa. Emilio Jacinto, meanwhile, the revolution's brain, wrote political essays expressed in the native language. This only shows that literature played a fundamental role in shaping society. Now let's proceed to the fifth importance of literature. Reading literature encourages contemplation and improves our language and vocabulary skills. This means that interacting and exposing ourselves to these texts develop not only our thinking abilities but also our speaking and writing skills. Number 6. Reading literature helps us understand humanity. The subject of literature is man. In the pages of a literary work, we learn about our soul, our conscience, our creative and moral faculties. Literature holds a mirror up to human nature, revealing our depths and complexities, virtues and vices. There are different Filipino literary periods. One of it is the pre-colonial period, early times to 1564. Long before the arrival of the Spaniards, ancient Filipinos were living in scattered barangays and ruled by different chieftains. Although they were living separately, they were similar in many ways. The religion, mode of dressing, houses, system of government, marriage practices, and economic activities. In short, they were refined and civilized. The process a distinct culture that distinguished them from other races. The roots of Philippine literature can be traced back to pre-colonial period. Literature in this period is any literature which existed before the Spaniards entered the Philippine soil. Literature was based on oral tradition, since no form of writing existing during that period. The only way to transmit knowledge during the pre-colonial period was acquired through observation, imitation, and practice. There was no formal education. Children were taught to read and write by their parents. Pre-colonial literature explains how the life and the world were created in the form of legends and myths. Subject matter is about the common experience of the people in the village, like their experiences in food gathering, caring for their children, nature, and etc. Now let's proceed to the pre-colonial Philippine literature. Pre-colonial literature tells the accounts of great people or supernatural heroes, as well as stories of gods and goddesses. The literary forms common in this period are riddles, proverbs, folk songs, epics, folktales, legends, and myths. The riddle uses the metaphor because it reveals subtle resemblances between two unlike objects. One wit is put to the test of answering riddles. The proverbs are nuggets of wisdom that show the community's norms, beliefs, and values. These are composed in short, rhyming verses. The folk song expresses the hopes and aspirations, the people's lifestyle, as well as their loves. Legends explains the origin of things, while epics and folktales explains how the world was created, or how the creatures possess certain traits. Some of our popular epics are Hudihud of Ifugao, Lamang of Ilocano, and Hinilawod of Sulud. Now let's proceed to the next Philippine literary period. The second is the Spanish period, which happened last 1565 to 1898. The period of Spanish colonization started in 1565 during the time of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, the first Spanish Governor-General in the Philippines. Literature started to flourish during his time. This sprout continued unabated until the Cavite Revolt in 1872. The Spaniards colonized the Philippines for more than 3 centuries. During these times, many changes occurred in the lives of Filipinos. They embraced the Catholic religion, changed their names, and were baptized. Spanish language became the literary language. The colonizers used the Catholic religion to substitute the existing tradition. Their lifestyle changed too. They built houses made of stones and bricks, used beautiful furniture like the piano, and used kitchen utensils. Carriages, trains, and boats were used as means of travel. They held fiestas to honor the saints, the Pope, and the governors. They had cockfights, horse races, and the theater as means of recreation. Literary works had a religious tone. Doctrina Christiana was the first book to be printed in the Philippines, written by Father Juan Valencia in Tagalog and Father Domingo Nieva in Spanish. The Spaniards rendered all writing systems inoperable. Now let's proceed Spanish influences on the Philippine literature. Aside from the Doctrina Christiana, the other literary works were ang Berlaan at Josefat, Pasyon, and Urbana at Felisa. There were also recreational plays during that time, such as Sinaculo, Zarzuela, Moro Moro, and Balagtasan. There were three popular writers during the Spanish period: Jose Rizal, Emilio Jacinto, and Andres Bonifacio. Jose Rizal's novels No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo and poems were the conclusion to the propaganda movement. His two novels portrays corruption and oppression by the Spanish government. Andres Bonifacio, who headed the Philippine Revolution, wrote Ang Pag-ibig sa Tinubuang Lupa. Emilio Jacinto, the revolution's brain, wrote political essays expressed in the native language. The common literary forms in the period were religious prose and poetry, pasyon, awit, corrido, political essays, political novels, essay, and short story. Until the 19th century, the religious orders owned and managed the printing presses. The propaganda movement was formed. It is a reform movement that arose among young Filipino expatriates in the late 19th century. The Filipino revolutionists won against the Spaniards who colonized for more than 300 years. On June 12, 1898, Emilio Aguinaldo raised the Philippine flag as a symbol of our independence. General Emilio Aguinaldo was selected as the first president of the Philippine Republic, but this was a short-lived. During the American colonization in 1898 to 1946, free public instruction for all children were introduced. English was the medium of instruction in all levels. The use of English as medium of instruction introduced Filipinos to Anglo-American modes of thought, culture, and lifeways that would be embedded not only in the literature but also in the psyche of the educated class. Many Filipino who started writing against the nationalism of the people remained undaunted. Filipino writers went into all forms of literature, like news reporting, poetry, stories, plays, essays, and novels. Their writings clearly depicted their love of country and their longings for independence. Because of this, Filipino literature was imitative of the American models of writing. Filipino writers went into all forms of literature, like news, reporting, poetry, short story, plays, essays, and novels. Here are some popular Filipino writers during the American period. In this period, the following writers and their works were notable. Paz Marquez Viñetas' Dead Stars was published and was made landmark of the maturity of the Filipino writers in English. Writing in a borrowed tongue, while writing about Filipino customs and traditions became prominent among major Filipino fictionists in English. How My Brother Leon Broke from a Wife by Manuel Argelia showed the scenery folkways of Ilocania. The stories of N.B.M. Gonzalez boosted the scenery and customs and traditions of Mindoro while depicting the characters in human dilemma of nostalgia and poverty. Other noted fictionists were Francisco Arcilla and Jose Garcia Villa. Now let's proceed to the Japanese period, 1941 to 1945. Between 1941 to 1945, the development of Philippine literature was interrupted due to the Japanese colonization. The stride and growth of the Philippine literature in English language and the development of the Philippine literature in general was interrupted during the Japanese period. There was The Japanese censored all publications except Tribune and Philippine Review. During the Japanese period, Filipino literature in English was stopped, and writers turned to writing in Filipino. Newspapers in English were banned by the Japanese. This became a blessing in disguise as writers started writing in Filipino. The weekly Liwayway was placed under strict surveillance, except for the Tribune and the Philippine Review. Most newspapers were stopped by the Japanese. This because of the prohibitions. Writing in English experienced a halt. This had advantageous effect on Filipino literature, which experienced renewed attention because writers in English turned to writing in Filipino. The common literary themes were nationalism, country, and life in the barrios. Filipino journalists during the Japanese period. What came out were journalistic writings. Journalists include Salvador P. Lopez, Wilfredo Maria Guerrero, Raul Manglapus, and Carlos Bulusan. Other Filipino writers during the Japanese period. Nick Joaquin wrote The Woman Who Looked Like Lazarus. A few poems were written by Fred Ruiz Castro. F.B. Casiano wrote essays in the Philippine Review. Carlos P. Romulo won the Pulitzer Prize for the works I Saw the Philippines, I See the Philippines Rise, and Mother America, and My Brother Americans. Now let's proceed to the 5th Philippine Literary Period. Under the Republic, 1946 to 1985. Post-war poetry and fiction were dominated by writers in English, who were educated and trained in writers' workshops in the United States or England. In the 1950s, every artist, writer, musician, critic, and academician was given a grant to stay in the U.S. through the Educational Exchange Program or the Fulbright Program. They lectured, observed, traveled, studied, and familiarized themselves with the cultural scene in that country. This gave Filipino writers the opportunity to keep up with the literary and artistic trends in the U.S. Here are some literary pieces under the Republic period. Macario Pineda's Ginto sa Makiling on 1946 was the first work that appeared after the Second World War. Stephen Javella's Without Seeing the Dawn on 1947. And Edelberto Tiafoe's Watch in the Night are novels about war. Amado Hernandez's Luha ng Buaya deal with the class struggle. Here are other literary pieces under the Republic period. Nick Joaquin's works deal with the country's various heritages and historical events, such as The Woman Who Had Two Navels, a portrait of an artist as Filipino, and May Day Eve. Some of the writers who had been educated and trained in workshops in the US and England were Edelberto and Edith Tiempo, Francisco Arcilla, Ricaredo de Mendelo, Amador Doge, Carlos Angeles, N.B.M. Gonzalez, and Bienvenido N. Santos. Most of them returned to the Philippines to teach. Now let's have the last Philippine literary period, the contemporary period on 1986 to present. The development of Philippine literature in various languages continued, especially in the new publications after the martial law years. Philippine literature in Tagalog was revived during this period. Most themes in the writings dealt with the Japanese brutalities of the poverty of life under the Japanese government and the brave guerrilla exploits. Contemporary period was a period of activism and literary revolution. The writers during this period used words to confront martial law and repression. Many young people became activists to ask for changes in the government. In the expression of this desire for change, keen were writings of some youth who were fired with nationalism in order to emphasize the importance of their petitions. The youth became completely rebellious during this period. This was proven not only in the plotted demonstrations and in the sidewalk expressions, but also in literature. Campus newspapers showed rebellious emotions. The once aristocratic writers developed awareness for society. They held pens and wrote on placards in red paints the equivalent of the word makipaka to dare. The irreverence or lack of respect for the poor reached its peak during this period of the mass revolution. This was also during this period that bomba films that discredit our ways as Filipinos started to come out. Behind these scenes, oral literature flourished in the outlying communities of the Cebuanos, the Ilocanos, the Tagalogs, the Samals, and the Ilonggos. The Philippine novel has remained social realist. It was also in this period when writers' workshops proliferated. Award-giving bodies, annual competitions, and publications provide the incentives for writers to keep producing literary works. Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards for Literature was established in 1950. The Palanca Memorial Awards for Literature had been giving cash prizes for short story, poetry, and one-act playwriting as an incentive to Filipino writers. The prizes came from Latineda Incorporated, the firm founded by the late Carlos Palanca Sr. Among the liberationist writers were Jose Lacaba, Epifanio San Juan, Rogelio Manghas, Lamberto Antonio, Lilia Mendoza, and Jesus Manuel Santiago. The Galian sa Arte at Tula nurtured Manila writers in writing during the darkest periods of martial law. Other contemporary poets are Marjorie Ipasco and Marjorie Alunay, as well as Ricardo de Oglia and Luisa Aguilar Carrillo. Some of the literary awards are the Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards for Literature, the Philippine Free Press, Philippine Graphics, some Home Life and Panorama Literary